Hey friends, welcome to our Bible study tonight on the book of Deuteronomy. Temporarily, we're calling this B3 for the Bellwood Bible broadcast, and I want to invite your attention to the book of Deuteronomy, and we will read chapter 26, verses 16 to 19, just to set the theme of this entire section. What we're looking at tonight are chapters 12 through 28. I'm going to take 2 weeks worth of material and give it to you this evening to prepare you for reading through the Bible. I suspect that there may not be many that will view this on 4th of July weekend, July 6th, that evening. In fact, I have to be out that evening, so I want to go ahead and cover about 2 weeks worth of material for you in this particular session. The thing that the point I want to make in this is Jesus Christ is Lord, and that is probably the primary contribution that Baptists have made to our understanding of the Christian life and the church. We didn't come up with the Trinity. We did not come up with inerrancy. We didn't come up with justification by faith. We didn't come up with biblical authority. But what we did notice in the scripture and tried to make loud to the world is that Jesus Christ is to be Lord of the Christian life and the church. Not tradition, not councils, not religious authorities, but Jesus and Jesus alone. And that has been the primary contribution that I think that we have made, and there are many that would argue that point. And so consequently, we don't baptize infants. That is traditional and has been for a couple thousand years, but we don't do that because it's not biblical. And so we've rejected that tradition. We love those who do that, of course, but we baptize only believers who are of a mind to repent and place faith in Jesus Christ. We make the mission of Christ our mission, not necessarily that of the denomination or anyone else for that matter. And that's what we do. We don't end up changing our morals and beliefs because the culture changes. We are very, very intent about Jesus Christ being Lord. And what you find in these chapters, beginning in Deuteronomy chapter 12 through chapter 28, is that you find an awful lot of commandments about just about everything in life. And that's what you find here. It's almost breathtaking how much material the Lord covers here in these chapters. He addresses everything to make Jesus Lord of everything. Now, the Methodist preacher P.T. Forsyth said that the first duty of every soul is to find not its freedom, but its master. We will be mastered by someone or something, and from that will flow everything else. And we've got to discover who our master is. And so what Jesus does here in the text is he shapes Israel into a missionary base, and he treats Israel much like a home. He takes over the home that they called Israel, and he may, come start with the gutters and then the landscaping, and then come into the house and look at the light fixtures and the paint and the carpet. But then he does something else with it. He begins to lay another foundation and build another room, because Jesus Christ does not merely intend on improving what we have in the home of our lives. Jesus Christ intends to move in and make it a palace for himself. And so everything has got to conform to him, and that's what we're wanting for Jesus to do with our lives. And there are several things that are very, very important here in the text. One is exclusive worship from chapters 12 through chapter 16. In chapter 12, they were to have a central sanctuary. They were to have a central sanctuary. Now, the theme of this section, again, is chapter 26, beginning in verse number 16. And here it says, "Today the Lord your God has commanded you to obey all these decrees and regulations, so be careful to obey them wholeheartedly. You've declared today that the Lord is your God, and you promise to walk in his ways and obey his decrees and commandments and regulations and do everything he tells you. The Lord has declared today that you are his people, his own special treasure, just as he promised, and that you must obey all his commands. And if you do, he will set you high above all other nations he's made. And then you'll receive praise and honor and renown You will be a nation that is holy to the Lord your God, just as he promised. Now, he begins this with exclusive worship all the way back in chapter number 12. And the emphasis here in chapter 12 is that there is to be one place to offer sacrifices and to honor the Lord. Chapter 12, verse 5, he said, rather, you must seek the Lord your God at the place of worship he himself will choose. And this was repeated several times in the text. Israel was to only offer sacrifices in one place. Now, the other nations of the world that surrounded them could offer sacrifices anyway, usually under a tree. And that was associated with pagan worship. But Israel was to offer sacrifices only at the tabernacle so that the Levites could regulate what was going on, they could control the theology, and they could make sure that it was done on the Lord's terms. And so that's extremely important when it comes to Israel's worship. They're to have one place of worship, one place of sacrifice. And in our day, God only has one place where any sacrifice is sufficient for salvation, and that's the cross of Calvary. The one place of blood sacrifice of lambs and goats and bulls in the Old Testament today is represented by the cross of Calvary. Jesus is the only way to God. The tabernacle was the only place to offer sacrifices. Jesus is the only way to God. His cross is our only hope. And so the one place of worship prefigured or shadowed what was coming up with Jesus being the only way. And then there's the sanctity of blood in chapter 12. They were to have intense respect about the blood. There was the allure of pagan gods in verses 29 and 31 in chapter 12. And it's rather remarkable here because the Lord tells them, do not be deceived by the practices of the surrounding nations, because you'll get so deceived you may even offer your children up for sacrifice. And that is the depth of human depravity. That is the depth of human sinfulness. That is the capacity to be deceived. And that's what the Lord warned about. And then there's the evil of false prophets and false gods, I guess I should say. And there were three pressure points that would bear on them about worshiping other gods. One was prophets with power in chapter 13. In chapter 13, verses 1 through 5, the Lord imagines and tells them, there may be some false prophets who come to you who have got real supernatural power, and they may perform some miracles. Do not follow after them. And of course, Paul would imagine this with some of the fake ministers of the church of Corinth who were actually angels of the enemy, dressed up as angels of light in 2 Corinthians 11, verse 14. And then when the Antichrist comes, he'll perform miracles as well. We've got to remember that not everything supernatural is necessarily of God. And so what you've got here is that you've got a pressure point where they would be pressured to worship other gods simply because a prophet was able to perform miracles. And I think as the time gets closer for Jesus to come get his church and for the tribulation to come, I expect that the counterfeit supernatural activity to increase, to soften up the culture in preparation for the Antichrist. The second pressure point in chapter 13 is family with influence. Prophets with power and family with influence in verses 6 through 11. Here, Moses imagines that family would come and pressure someone to worship other gods. Of course, Jesus would say, you've got to put me first, even ahead of your family. And then there's pressure point number 3, and that's communities with numbers. Entire cities and towns would turn to false gods. And it's very hard to tell an entire city and town no, especially when you have to stand alone. And that's chapter 13, verses 12 through 18. It's very intimidating to go against the flow, but oftentimes real Christianity has got to do that. So there's the evil of false prophets. Then in chapter 14, verses 1 through 21, there's the distinction between clean and unclean animals. The clean they could eat, the unclean they could not. And that's chapter 14, verses 1 through 21. Somebody wrote the etiquette expert Emily Post a letter and asked her the question. And she responded in the newspapers in which she was syndicated. And they asked the question, what's the correct procedure when one is invited to the White House but has a previous engagement? The question is, how do you tell the White House, no, I have a previous engagement? And Emily Post wrote back, an invitation to dine at the White House is a command, and it immediately cancels any other engagement. And that is what the Lordship of Jesus Christ does. His Lordship cancels all other rivals. Well, they cover that in chapters 12 through 16. But in the middle of chapter 16, we find an exalted people. And there are several people that are exalted here for consideration. There's the poor, they're men, they're judges, they're kings, they're the Levites, they're other nations, and then there are prophets. In chapter 15, he talks about the poor. And they were to have some very gracious and compassionate responses to the poor. The goal and vision of Israel is there are to be no poor folks among you. In fact, if poor people took out personal loans from other Israelites, those loans were to be completely canceled in the 7th year, and they were to be offered at no interest. Can you imagine if all the debt everyone had to be canceled after 7 years? None of these 30 some odd years of making credit card payments with the minimum payment. Can you imagine what would happen in the economy with something like that? Of course, that would affect the rate at which people would make loans and the kind of loans people would take out. It's a very complicated thing and frankly beyond me. But poor folks had all their debts canceled after the 7 years. And then there were times, in chapter 15, verse 12 through 18 reflects this, that people would give themselves into servanthood to someone to pay off their debts. It was called servitude. And they would serve for 6 years with another Jew if that Jew would pay off their debts, if that Israelite would pay off their debts. And at the end of those 6 years, they were released and completely free. So there was no lifelong servitude unless the servant volunteered for it. And so the idea that the Old Testament commanded slavery is not right. There was a servitude approach, though, and it was very gracious and compassionate to the poor. Men in chapter 16 are to show up for 3 festivals a year, no matter where they are in the world. Passover, harvest, and the Feast of Shelters. And then judges in chapter 16 and 17 are to show no partiality in judgment. Everyone is to be equal before the law. Then in capital cases in chapter 17, verses 1 through 7, no one is to be convicted or even charged unless there are 2 or 3 eyewitnesses to the capital case. And I find that very, very helpful. That would solve a lot of problems in many justice systems. And then if a case that was not capital and there were not 2 or 3 eyewitnesses could not be resolved, they took it to the priest and they sought the Lord over it. Then there were king's qualifications in chapter 17, verses 14 through 22, and the king was to have some qualifications. He was in verse 15 to be the one God chooses. They were not to return to Egypt to buy horses. They were not to have many wives. They were not to have much wealth. And the king, whoever he would be, was to make himself a copy of the law and to read it. And I sure do wish Solomon had followed this. It makes you wonder if Solomon had done what the Lord wanted him to do, what would have happened to Israel? I would like to think they would not have divided into 2 kingdoms and that we would not have lost the 10 tribes, northern tribes of Israel. In chapter 18, they're the Levites and their income. They had no land. God didn't give them any land to grow crops or to raise livestock. And so they had to depend upon the tithes of the people. The nations of the world in chapter 18, verses 9 through 14, their customs were to be rejected, especially child sacrifice. And that was a real concern that God had about the people of Israel, that they would go so far as to sacrifice their children. And then their prophets in chapter 18, verses 15 through 22. And I want you to see the test of a true prophet. The test of a true prophet in chapter 18, verse 21. It says here, but you may wonder, how will we know whether or not a prophecy is from the Lord? Well, if a prophet speaks in the Lord's name, but his prediction does not happen to come true, you'll know the Lord did not give that message. The prophet has spoken without my authority and need not be feared. Whether someone is true in what they say about the future is pretty clear. If it comes true, they're from the Lord. If not, you don't need to fear them or respect what they say. Then in chapter 19, through the first 8 verses of chapter 22, there are embittered relationships. When some relationships get to the point where they can be afflicted by bitterness, there are ways to handle this. In chapter 19, verses 1 through 13, you've got killers and the aggrieved family. Someone accidentally kills someone, they make a mistake and they're killed. They don't premeditate this killing. They're not malicious at all, but they end up killing someone. They had some cities of refuge to which they could flee if the family tried to hunt them down and take their lives. And so God was very, very considerate of that. And so killers and the aggrieved, then neighbors and a landowner. Somebody might have a dispute about the boundaries of land. And he would say in chapter 19, verse 14, don't move the landmark that marks off the land of one another. Then there are people that are accused and eyewitnesses in chapter 19, verses 15 through 21. In verse 15 of chapter 19, the need for 2 or 3 eyewitnesses is repeated. And that's just extremely important. We are finding in this day revenge accusations and just unbridled, passionate, bitter accusations made against people that simply are not true. And it's especially infected the political class. And I'm very, very concerned about that. Chapter 19, verse 19 also makes it clear if someone falsely accuses someone else, and it's a false accusation and shown to be false, the one who falsely accused receives the penalty that would have come upon the accused had they been found guilty. Then there's Israel and enemies in chapter 22, verses 1 through 22. The Lord is emphatic here. Do not be afraid in verses 1 through 4. In other words, take confidence because I'm with you. I remember when I was a boy in Houston, we would play sandlot baseball. A bunch of 8, 9-year-old boys get out there and we'd have a pickup baseball game. And my team oftentimes was on the short end of victory. But once in a while, one of the bigger boys in the neighborhood would come join us. And if we were shorthanded, the bigger boy would join our team and we'd be thrilled. You know, some 12-year-olds show up to face our opponents, 8 and 9-year-old opponents. That really excited us because the 12-year-old was with us and on our side. And that's the same kind of courage that the Israelites were to take with the Lord being on their side. Then in chapter 22, verses 10 through 18, the Lord tells them that they're to approach an enemy in a certain way. And I want you to read there with me in chapter 22, beginning in verse number, well, hold on just a minute. In chapter 22, let me just tell you the story here. They were to come upon a place if they were to engage in war, and they were to offer peace first. And if they accepted the terms of peace, then they would be put under servitude with Israel. But if they refused peace, then they would fight. And this previews what's going on in the church age right now. The ascended Lord has told us to go into the world and offer peace. If they do not accept his peace of the gospel, one day he's going to return and implement the judgments you find in the book of Revelation. So that's Israel and enemies. Then we've got corpses and we've got priests as well. If there's a dead body found someplace, and no one knows what has happened to the body, they are to take the priest from the nearest town, and they are to come and examine things and go seek the Lord over that. They'll offer sacrifices, and they will not be held liable for that. Then we've got some other or embittered relationships between spouses and kids. How do you handle that? And chapter 21 talks about that. Then there are issues of life and death. Life and death are embattled against us in chapter 21 through chapter 22, verse 8. Then there's possible embittered relationships between men and women in chapter 22. Then between God and the worshiper, and then outcast in society. And so what you find here is God anticipates trouble to arise in relationships, and he gives solution to that before these issues arise. God is very, very well prepared. God is several steps ahead of us in every relationship. God already knows how things will go when you gather with your family for Thanksgiving. God already knows how things will go when you're gathered with your family for Christmas. And sometimes in families and extended families, there can be some tension, but God already knows. He's going to handle that. And he's given you guidance for that. Then in chapter 23 through chapter 25, there is empathetic consideration. And I want you to understand that some of the mindset and the context here in Israel reminds me of a sports league one of my children played in. They would get out on the field and they'd play ball. And sometimes one boy might be a little rough with another. And in the stands, and this has rarely ever happened and just in this one place, but one mother might stand up, and this community was very, 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 very noted for this. One mother or father might stand up and complain about how a child on the field was treating her or his child. And the mother in the stands of the boy that was accused would stand up and say something to him. And oftentimes after the game, well, not oftentimes, but on occasion, they go into the parking lot and settle it. And so sometimes you'd have these fights between women in the parking lot, and sometimes fights between men in the parking lot over what happened in the field. Now, my attitude is, let it happen on the field and let the umpire referee handle that. Don't you haul it to the parking lot. But that's some of the mindset of some of these ancient peoples. And Israel is coming out of Egypt, and they've got some of the same brutal mindset. And so God, here in this text, says, I want you to have empathetic consideration. I want you to put yourself in that person's place and feel what they feel. Think what they think and try to understand where it is that they're coming from. He does that with lots of cases. And this is all case law that is just fascinating. People that borrow money in chapter 23. The obligation of vows in chapter 23. A neighbor with the vineyard. You go through, you can pick some grapes off the vine and eat those, but you can't gather them into a container. Then the reputation of a divorcee in chapter 24. A man might marry a woman and be dissatisfied with her. Not that there's anything wrong with the woman, but he may divorce her, but he's got to give her a special certificate, a writ of divorce to make it clear he made the decision that there's nothing wrong with her, so she doesn't have to live with the stigma of that divorce. It's him, it's not her. And so there's great consideration that takes place there. There's consideration for newlyweds in chapter 24, verse 5. There's consideration for the tools of those who from whom someone may borrow. There's the health of the community in chapter 24, verses 8 and 9. There's the dignity of borrowers in chapter 24, verses 10 through 15. And I want you to read that with me. It says here, if you lend anything to your neighbor, do not enter his house to pick up the item he's giving as security. So they give collateral for an item that they might borrow. Don't go into his house to take the collateral. You must wait outside while he goes in and brings it out. If your neighbor is poor and gives you his coat as security for a loan, don't keep it overnight. Return the cloak to its owner by sunset, that he can stay warm through the night and bless you. And the Lord your God will count you as righteous. And so you don't go into the home to take collateral. That would embarrass him, that in front of his wife and children. You don't do that. And then if he gives you his coat as collateral, well, think about that. Have some compassion and give it to him when the sun goes down, or right before the sun goes down. Now, I want you to look with me in chapter 24, verses 19 through 22, and I want you to consider the food sources of the poor. Watch this. When you're harvesting your crops and forget to bring in a bundle of grain from your field, don't go back to get it. Leave it for foreigners, orphans, and widows. Then the Lord your God will bless you in all you do. And you know something? That's what set up Jesus' great-great-great-great-grandmother, Ruth, to marry Boaz when she was a single widow. Then he goes on to say, when you beat the olives from your olive tree, don't go over the boughs twice. Leave the remaining olives for the foreigners, orphans, and widows. When you gather grapes in your vineyard, don't glean the vines after they're picked. Leave the remaining grapes for foreigners, orphans, and widows. Remember, you were slaves in the land of Egypt. That's why I'm giving you this commandment. And so there's to be great empathetic consideration. I want you to look also at safety for those that are actually guilty. Chapter 25, verses 1 through 3. Suppose two people take a dispute to court, and the judge declares that one is right, the other's wrong. If the person in the wrong is sentenced to be flogged or beaten, the judge must command him to lie down and be beaten in his presence, with the number of lashes appropriate to the crime. So it's to happen in the presence of the judge. The punishment is to fit the crime. And then, verse 3, but never give more than 40 lashes. More than 40 lashes would publicly humiliate your neighbor. So there's empathetic consideration here. Well, it goes on with being considerate of oxen and a deceased brother, even your husband's enemy, how you deal with customers, and then the Amalekites as well. So there is to be, they're to consider others, and then they're consider their gifts to God in chapter 26. Then they're to consider obedience to God as well. The final section here is that they're to be expectant or emphatic, with emphatic outcomes. There are emphatic outcomes here in the text. And from chapter 27 to chapter 28, there are a lot of blessings and curses that are announced here in the text. Now, let me wrap this up with three statements here that we need to keep in mind that I think will help us. One, we need regulations for life. We need this kind of specific guidance in our life. Lordship specifies regulations. Now, in the New Testament, Jesus and the apostles really simplify this all in love. That ends up being the greatest commandment, love for God. And the second is love your neighbor as yourself. And then that's how we identify ourselves. Israel would identify itself with the law and the great wisdom that it embodied, but we end up identifying ourselves by love. By this, others will know that we are his disciples. And so the Lord graciously has simplified all of that. And I want to have you look at Romans chapter 13, verses 8 through 10. Owe nothing to anyone except for your obligation to love one another. If you love your neighbor, you will fulfill the requirements of God's law. For the commandments say you must not commit adultery, must not murder, must not steal, must not covet. These and other such commandments are summed up in this one commandment. Love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to others, so love fulfills the requirements of God's law. When we love people, we are very considerate of them. But let me say to you, if you're isolated from people and you're not making friends consistently and constantly, if you're not looking after their spiritual need, even the spiritual need of new friends and strangers, it's really hard to love in isolation. We've got to be the kind of people that have high energy for connecting with other people if we're going to love. And so that may mean we've got to change. We've got to change. That reminds me of the story of a U.S. naval destroyer that's out on the ocean, out on the East Coast, and it sees some lights ahead. And the captain of the destroyer tells his signalman to signal, alter your course 10 degrees to the south so they don't run into each other. Alter your course 10 degrees to the south. Promptly, a return message was received. You alter your course 10 degrees to the north. Well, the captain was angered that his command had been ignored, and so he had another message sent. Alter your course 10 degrees to the south. I'm the captain. Another message was received from these lights. Alter your course 10 degrees to the north. I'm a seaman, third class. Immediately, the captain of the destroyer sent another message. Alter your course 10 degrees to the south. I'm a U.S. naval destroyer. And the reply came back. Alter your course 10 degrees to the north. I'm a lighthouse. God Almighty is immovable. He doesn't change. We do. We need regulations for life. Lordship specifies regulations, but then we need reminders of grace. Lordship magnifies grace. It's really remarkable in this text how it is spiced with grace. There's grace in our past 9 times. There's grace for the present in just these chapters 5 times. And there's grace for the future 34 times in just these chapters 12 through 28. Folks, that's, my goodness, that's 44 mentions of God's grace. In the past, he talks about, I took you out of Egypt, out of slavery. And we need to always remember the salvation of Jesus Christ, what he purchased for us at Calvary. Then there's grace for the present. He is with us, and he loves being with us, and he has made us his special treasure. And that's mentioned several times in these chapters. And then there's grace for all our future needs. He makes awesome, precious promises, and in the history of Israel, he fulfilled every one of them. Here's the point I want to make. Resources and redemption come before regulations and responsibilities. We always have to start our instruction with the grace of God and then follow it with his expectations, so that we're not merely humanly producing love and obedience, but instead we are encountering the power of God, and Jesus is doing it through us. Michael Catt used to say that all God ever expected from us on our own is failure. And that's true. We can't change our heart. We sometimes can't even change our mind. But when the grace of God gets a hold of somebody, some awesome things can happen in a person's life. So, the grace of God is just an awesome, awesome thing. Now, I've got to tell you, talking about grace as a Bible teacher, I get frustrated because I feel like I cannot articulate God's grace as well as I know it. And Charles Spurgeon talked about that one time in his autobiography. He said this, and this is kind of lengthy. I'm persuaded that there are more delights in Christ, yes, more joy in one glimpse of his face than is to be found in all the praises of this harlot world and all the delights which it can yield to us in its sunniest and brightest days. I'm persuaded that what he's been till now, he will be to the end. And where he has begun a good work, he'll carry it on. I have seen hundreds and thousands who've given their hearts to Jesus, but I never did see one who was disappointed with him. I've never met one who said Jesus was less than he declared to be. Now, when my eyes first beheld him, when the burden slipped off my heavy laden shoulders, and I was free from condemnation, I thought all the preachers I'd ever heard had not half preached. They'd not half told the beauty of my Lord and Master. So good, so generous, so willing to forgive. It seemed to me as if they had almost slandered him. Now, they described his likeness doubtless as well as they could, but it was a mere smudge compared with the matchless beauties of his face. All who've ever seen him will say the same. I go back to my home after preaching many a time, mourning that I cannot preach my Master even as I myself know him. And what I know of him is very little compared with the matchlessness of his grace. Would that I knew more of him and I could tell it out better. And that's how I feel. It sure is a hard thing to be a preacher. But there's a final thing here. We need repetition of truth. Lordship needs repetition. Let me ask you this question. I asked you this last week. Do you remember the sermon from this morning or the sermon last week? See, that proves we need repetition. And these things are subjects that are actually found in the previous books of Moses. A lot of these subjects appear in Leviticus and the book of Numbers, and they're repeated a third time in the book of Deuteronomy. And so we've got to have repetition. And that's why I preach the gospel every Sunday. That's why I preach on the power of prayer and the promises of God. We need repetition. Hey, the truth is, Jesus is either Lord of all or he's not Lord at all. And so we've got to give it all to him, no matter what it is. Every place in the world, Jesus looks at it and says, that's mine. It belongs to me. Now, D.L. Moody was the Billy Graham of the 1800s, and he heard Henry Varley speak one time. Now, Henry Varley never really remembered saying this when D.L. Moody was present, but it changed D.L. Moody's life. And here's what he said. The world is yet to see what God can do with and for and through and in a man who is fully and wholly consecrated to him. And D.L. Moody said, by the grace of God, that will be me. Hey, make that you. Jesus, Lord of